So when you're just getting started with growing cut flowers, the most common piece of advice that you'll often hear from more experienced growers is to start small. And honestly, that is good advice. It's a way of giving yourself permission to begin on a flower farming adventure without feeling overwhelmed. It's a reminder that the flower farm you dream of, it doesn't have to be the flower farm that you start with. But here's the thing. When I was just starting out, starting small didn't feel all that helpful. All of my resources already felt small. The space I had available to me, the budget I was working with, even the time I had in my schedule to focus on flowers, it was all limited. Starting small wasn't something necessarily that I chose for myself, it was just the reality of my circumstances. And so when I'd hear that advice from more experienced growers to start small, well, I wasn't looking for reassurance. I had bigger questions that I needed answered. Questions like, well, how many bouquets can I realistically get from a small plot? What flower varieties would be most essential in a cutting garden? Would it be better to focus on high-dollar crops or aim for a higher quantity of stems? Really, what I was looking for was practical ideas on how to make the most of what little I felt that I had. Back then, I couldn't see beyond the size component. I believed that more flowers, well, it meant more customers, and more customers meant a more successful business. So naturally, when I looked out at my small patch of land, it never felt like enough. Especially not for someone like me, someone who wanted to turn this love of growing flowers into something real, something viable, something that could support a business. But recently, I traveled north to northern Michigan to attend a floral design workshop hosted by a florist in the area. One who was focused on wedding florals. Now, to be clear, I have no intention of adding event work to what we offer here at Two Sisters Flower Farm, but I went to this design-intensive weekend because I wanted to stretch myself creatively, to refine my design skills, and to see how or if it would change the way I operate my business. Turns out, it did. The biggest shift for me came during a session on bridal bouquet design. Now, since this was a business-focused workshop, we were encouraged to treat these arrangements like real client work, sticking to a recipe that made sense within a given flower budget. And when it came time for us, the attendees, to build our bouquets, we were given a challenge. Design something visually stunning and well-balanced using a limited number of stems. I think my final bouquet had just 18 stems in it. And standing there, holding this delicate bouquet that I just created, well, something clicked. Early on in my flower farming journey, I used to think that value came from volume, that the more I added, the better it would be. But in that moment, I realized that value doesn't come from quantity. It comes from how well each flower is used. Now, this was a design lesson, yes, but more than that weekend I spent up north, it challenged everything I thought I knew about garden planning. Because for the first time, I had proof of something that I've long believed, but I've never quite been able to articulate. That is, you can make something valuable with less. You can create something beautiful without growing at all. And yes, you can absolutely get the most out of a small garden space. And to prove it, I'm going to recreate a similar bouquet for you here today. We'll break it down into its components, and then I'll show you how I'd go about planning a cutting garden for a small space, using the same intentional approach that I learned during this aha moment I had at this recent workshop. Because I want you to know, whether you're working with a few raised beds, a small plot, or even containers on your patio, you can still create something beautiful, intentional, and uniquely yours. Okay, let's go shopping for some flowers. So back when I first started flower farming, I remember hearing this advice about reverse engineering. Starting with the end goal and working backward to figure out what I would need for my cutting garden. And in theory, this idea makes a lot of sense. But back then, practically, it felt daunting. I mean, it's one thing to know that you should plan your garden like a bouquet, thinking about the flowers that you'll want to have for arranging later on. But when you're just starting out, that advice can feel frustrating. Because how are you supposed to know what you'll need when you've never even made a bouquet before? I get it. I've been there myself, staring at seed packets in an empty garden plot, trying to picture what those tiny seeds would become and how they'd eventually work all together. I wanted a clear vision, but back then all I had was this vague hope that it would somehow all come together. You don't have to know exactly what the final picture looks like right now. Sometimes you just need to take that first step, start with what you have, and learn as you go. I know what tripped me up the most early on wasn't just the process of reverse engineering. It was figuring out the purpose of each flower. I kept hearing about focal, filler, foliage, and flare flowers, and those labels made sense on a basic level, but they were so broad that I couldn't picture how to actually plan my garden around them. I needed something more concrete, something that would help me understand how these flowers would work together when I was harvesting and designing with them. I realized at some point that I needed to define the roles differently. Instead of sticking with those vague categories, I decided to think about the flowers in terms of how they would function in a bouquet. And that small shift, well, it made all the difference. That's when things really started to click for me. Instead of asking, well, what should I grow? I started asking, what kind of arrangements do I want to create? What roles do my flowers need to play? What ingredients will be the most versatile and worthwhile for my small space? That simple shift made me a better flower farmer and a more confident grower. Because when you plan your garden like a bouquet, you're not just planting flowers. You're setting yourself up to create something beautiful and intentional, even if you're still figuring out the end result. Here's a breakdown of the framework that I now use. Let's start with focal flowers. And I know, I just said that focal, filler, and flare weren't the most helpful categories, and then the first category I mentioned is in fact focal. But stick with me here. That one's an overlap because honestly it just makes sense. Focal flowers are the showstoppers, the ones that immediately catch your eye and anchor the entire arrangement. They're bold and often larger in scale, and they set the tone for the entire design. But here's the thing, even though they stand out, you usually don't need very many of them to make an impact. That's why in this bouquet, we only have a few dedicated focal flowers. I'll actually break down the more precise percentages a little later on, so be sure to stick around to the end of this video for that. But the point here is that the majority of your garden doesn't need to be filled with center of attention focal flowers. In fact, if you're working with a small garden space, growing too many focals can actually backfire, leaving you with a lot of bold blooms but not enough to fill out your bouquets. That's why I like to limit my garden to just a few types of focal flowers, ones that work well together. Think of it this way, instead of having a dozen different types of showy blooms, I'd rather have a reliable handful that I know can make an impact. I'll plant enough to feel abundant but still manageable. I will say it's tempting to grow every beautiful variety that you see online, but I've learned that a more curated selection of focal flowers keeps things feeling intentional rather than chaotic. Plus, when you have just a few reliable focal varieties, it makes bouquet making a lot simpler and more cohesive. This way, no matter how small your garden space is, you always have something that feels purposeful. Plus, it's easier to coordinate your design when the main characters don't all compete for attention. Now, I know in this example I'm using more traditional florist type flowers. It's honestly early in the season and our cutting garden isn't yet in bloom, but some examples of focal flowers that we grow are things like the Benary's giant zinnias, sunflowers, and of course, dahlias. So if focal flowers are the stars, then mass flowers are the supporting cast, the ones that make the whole arrangement feel complete. They add volume and fill in the gaps, supporting the focal flowers by enhancing color, texture, or tone. Essentially, they do the heavy lifting when it comes to making your arrangement feel full and well-rounded. Now, here's something that took me a while to realize when I was starting out growing flowers. Not every bloom and arrangement needs to stand out. In fact, some of the most beautiful bouquets are the ones where a few flowers take center stage while the rest quietly elevate the whole look. That's where mass flowers really shine. Think of it like this. Some flowers are simply there to create a backdrop, a base layer that makes the focal flowers pop. You might not notice every single mass flower individually, but without them, the whole arrangement would feel sparse or incomplete. That's why I like to choose mass flowers that are versatile and easy to grow. Neutrals and soft pastels are especially useful because they pair well with just about everything. I personally look for varieties that blend seamlessly into multiple color palettes so I can use them within a variety of designs. And because mass flowers are the backbone of so many arrangements, I prioritize ones that are prolific bloomers and long-lasting in the vase. Some examples of mass flowers that we grow here at Two Sisters include things like Statice, Ageratum, Yarrow, Coxcomb Celosia, smaller Queenie zinnias, and even marigolds can be mass flowers. Okay, let's keep moving on. Now, if mass flowers are the supportive backbone, then line flowers are what gives your bouquet its shape and movement. They're the ones that add structure, keeping your arrangements from looking like a round, dense puff of blooms. Think of them as the guiding line that lead your eye throughout the bouquet. Even though you don't need a lot of them, they're incredibly important for creating that balanced, airy feel. I mean, without line flowers, even the most beautiful arrangements can feel static or flat. The beauty of line flowers is in their ability to create flow. They're often tall with a vertical presence that naturally draws your attention upward or outward. Instead of clumping together, they reach out, giving the whole arrangement a sense of movement and life. When I'm choosing line flowers for my small space, I think about shapes that naturally have that vertical or wispy quality, like snapdragons or stock or even flowering branches. These types of flowers help guide the overall shape, giving it that organic, garden-grown look rather than feeling too manicured. Now, other types of flowers that can work as line flowers include things like celosia or even basil. I know that might sound a little bit unexpected, but when I'm working with more traditional greenery, I often end up stripping away a lot of that lower foliage, leaving just the top leaves intact. This creates a long, clean stem that naturally gives height and structure to the arrangement, much like a classic line flower. Here's what I want you to keep in mind. Line flowers don't have to be flashy to be effective. Sometimes the most delicate stems can create the biggest impact just by the way they stretch or lean. I always make sure to include a few of these in my garden plan because they add that essential dynamic element without overwhelming the design. In my experience, they're not meant to be the star of the show, but they're what make the whole arrangement feel intentional rather than crowded. It's amazing how just a few well-placed line flowers can make a bouquet feel balanced and thoughtfully composed. Last but certainly not least, let's talk about accents. If focal flowers are the stars and line flowers are the guides, then accents are the little details that make your bouquet feel really special. They're the finishing touch, the unexpected pop of texture or color that adds personality and charm. You don't need many of them to make an impact. In fact, just a few well-placed accent stems can completely change the mood of your arrangement. They're like the sprinkles on top of a cupcake. Small, but they make the whole thing feel more complete. I like to think of accent flowers as the playful elements, the ones that add a bit of whimsy or surprise. Sometimes they're uniquely shaped, like a curly vine on a frilly bloom, and other times they're more understated, but have a texture that stands out. These are the flowers that make people lean in for a closer look. When planning my garden, I give myself permission to be a little bit more spontaneous with accent flowers. I might grow something just because I love it or because it feels a little bit different from the rest of my main crops. For me, this means things like herbs or trailing vines, anything that adds a little bit of personality. And here's the thing, not every bouquet needs a lot of accents. Sometimes just a touch of something unexpected is enough to add that little bit of drama that you're looking for. It's really less about quantity and more about placing them strategically to draw the eye. In a small garden space, it's easy to feel like accents are an afterthought, but I found that even just one or two can elevate a bouquet from simple to stunning. It's a great way to add a personal touch and show off a bit of creativity without needing a whole garden bed dedicated to accents. Now, to give you some examples, for me, I often reach for cosmos or gomphrena as my accent flowers. These flowers, they have a lightweight, airy quality that makes them perfect for creating pops of color and movement. I actually like to let them float just above the rest of my arrangement, almost like little accents that dance on top. They don't dominate the bouquet, but they definitely catch your eye and add that touch of whimsy that makes the whole design feel more dynamic and lively. It's really one of my favorite ways to give a bouquet a little extra personality without overwhelming the overall look. Now, not every bouquet I create will be an exact replica of this one that I have here, and that's okay. Just know that you don't need to reinvent the wheel every time you design a bouquet. For me, I like to use a simple recipe like this as a template, and then I create variety by substituting the types of flowers or switching out colors to change up the color scheme. So if we break down this bouquet into its components, here's what we get. Out of the 22 stems that I used, roughly 25 to 30% were focal flowers. 20 to 25% were line flowers. 30 to 40% were mass flowers. And just a couple, about 5 to 10% were accent flowers. Now, your percentages may look a little different, and that's totally okay. We all have our own design styles, and part of the fun is figuring out what works best for you. But knowing how I like to construct my bouquets, I can use these rough percentages as a guide when planning my cutting garden, scaling up or down depending on how much space I have available, making sure that I'm growing enough of each ingredient to create the look that I love. So here's a mock-up of what that would look like in real life. Now, beyond being more intentional with what you plant, I want to give you a few more tips to get the most from your small garden space. My first tip, and one of the best ways to maximize your space, is to plant more of one color rather than trying to grow all the colors. I actually shared in a recent video where I designed a daffodil arrangement that creating pockets of color can be more impactful than trying to sprinkle in lots of color throughout a single arrangement. The consistent color creates areas of focus, places for your eyes to rest. Knowing this now, I realize that I don't necessarily need more variety to create beautiful arrangements. Sometimes repetition, especially with color, can be incredibly powerful. Now, another tip that made a huge difference for me, especially when I was just starting out, is to choose cut and come again type flowers, things like zinnias, cosmos, or dahlias. Now, I don't know about you, but in my very first year of growing, one of my biggest hurdles was that I didn't want to cut the flowers I had grown. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I was scared to waste good blooms. Instead of just giving it a shot, I froze and did nothing. Looking back, I now know that getting better at anything means getting the reps in. You have to actually practice cutting, arranging, and experimenting. And while you can ensure a continual harvest of blooms through more advanced garden planting methods like succession planting, and I will say on a side note, if you're interested, I do have a whole video on how to succession plant your flowers, which I'll link for you in the description box below. But my question to you is, why make it harder on yourself when you're just starting out? My recommendation is to choose flowers that naturally produce more the more you cut from them. Take the pressure off of yourself. You don't have to worry about messing up because new blooms are always on the way. One last suggestion I have for you to make the most of a small garden space is to prioritize multi-use flowers, the kinds that can pull double duty in your arrangements. For example, gomphrena, it can serve as an accent flower when left tall, but it can also work as a mass flower when cut shorter and clustered together. Having a few of these versatile blooms in your garden means you get more flexibility in your designs without needing to plant as many different varieties. By planning your garden with intention and focusing on the roles each flower will play, you'll be able to create cohesive, beautiful arrangements even when your space feels limited. And by choosing flowers that keep on giving and that can fill multiple roles, well, you'll build confidence with every cut, learning as you go without feeling like you're risking it all on a single harvest. I'll be honest, I used to think a small garden meant small results. But I now know that it's not about having more. It's about making the most of what you have. And when you plan with purpose, when you choose flowers based on how they'll work together, well, something magical happens. Your garden becomes more functional, your arrangements become more fluid, and your confidence as a grower, well, it blooms right alongside your flowers. So if you're staring at your growing space this season, wondering if it's enough, well, I hope this video gives you a little bit of peace. You don't need rows and rows of flowers to build a beautiful business or to simply enjoy the process of creating something meaningful. You just need clarity, a little planning, and a whole lot of heart. Whether you're planting 1 bed or 10, I hope this new way of looking at your garden opens up possibility rather than making you feel pressure. Because a thoughtfully grown garden, even a small one, is more than enough to create beauty that lasts. Now, if you need further help with your garden planning, you're going to want to check out these 2 videos, which I'll link for you in the description box below. The first one is the Acre Cut Garden Plan, and in this video I walk you through my process for designing a cutting garden. The second is my favorite cut flowers to grow from seed, and here I share my favorite low-risk flowers to include in your cutting garden. Use the images and examples that I share there to really visualize the flowers that will work best for your garden space. I hope it gives you the inspiration and the confidence to really take that next step with your flower growing. Let me just say thank you guys so much for tuning in. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you found the content helpful, and as always, I'll catch you in the next video. Bye guys.